Colombians.
Everyone that I said I'm going to Colombia, they're like, oh, that's different.
Yeah.
Be careful.
Yeah, they're like, oh, there's
Why?
hopefully a safe part.
From Frequency Media, this is Globocurious, an immersive travel podcast about the magic of curiosity, discovery, and human connection. I'm Michelle Khouri, and this week we're headed to Medellin, Colombia. The city of eternal spring. A quick Google search will tell you that Medellin earned that nickname due to its year-round temperate climate. But spend a few days there and you'll likely find more meaning behind it than just good weather. Much like brittle branches sprouting flowers after months of debilitating frost, Medellin's history of unrelenting violence has somehow left it more abloom than ever. From the moment I arrived at Medellin's International Airport, I understood firsthand why this city's people, known as paisas, are famously the kindest in Colombia, a country already known for having some of the most hospitable people in the world. And all I had to do to find out was hail a cab.
Taxi. Calle
10, 270. Bien, anillo.
That's me cracking jokes with the cab drivers, the eldest of whom made sure one of the younger drivers got assigned my ride in an obvious effort to make sure everyone was taken care of that day. This is very much the Colombian way, a way of life I was raised in. See, not all destinations we visit have strong personal ties, but this one does. Which is why, before I can tell you about Medellin, I need to tell you a little bit about me. I've been visiting Colombia since I was 8 months old. Even though my father was Argentinian, my Colombian mother made sure to raise me immersed in the culture, food, and customs of her country. I am thus the product of a strange cultural combination. An American-born, Colombian-raised, Argentine-influenced, Miami-bred hybrid with a genealogy report that tells me I'm 3/4 Spanish and 1/4 Middle Eastern. In other words, roots that have never been deep enough to fully call myself one thing or another. It can be as lonely as it is freeing, as exciting as it is isolating. What does it feel like to half belong to a place at best? To carry its stories in your blood but not fully in your skin, to grow up with its culture, its language, its history, and yet feel like an outsider when you stand in its streets. This is Medellin for me. On the other hand, for my cousins Mo and Dre, Medellin is core to their family history. They are intertwined with its legacy. Dre was getting married near Medellin, and so our very large, very scattered family was descending upon the city in the days prior. I got to town a few days before the whirlwind weekend of family events took over, and it just so happened that Mo and his wife Ashley were getting to town on the same day. One thing about me, I love a good guided tour. And on my first day in any destination, I especially aim for booking a full-day tour that can give me some fundamental history on the area and also a sense of place, the lay of the land. Which is why my first 2 days in Medellin included guided tours. On the first, I joined a day tour that introduced me to some of Medellin's most iconic landmarks and history. On the second, I ventured out of the city to Guatape and El Peñón. By the third day, I was ready to explore at my own pace, visiting the Casa Museo de la Memoria and one of the city's bustling fruit markets. Within an hour of landing, I met up for dinner with Mo and Ashley at Alambique, a jaw-droppingly beautiful restaurant in the heart of El Poblado where we were all staying. Walking into Alambique once again brought me face to face with that paisa hospitality I'd heard so much about. That's a server at the restaurant giving me an impromptu tour of the 3-story space that looked like a cross between an apothecary, a library, and Narnia. The moment I told him I'd arrived from Atlanta 2 hours prior, he seemed dead set on giving me an unforgettable experience. He showed me the waiting room, the dining room, and the terrace, all while trying to accommodate my last-minute table of 3 on a booked-up night. I was glowing by the time he sat me at a communal table to wait for my cousins. They arrived within a couple minutes, and I immediately started to rattle on about my 2 hours of discovery since landing in Medellin.
Of how lush and
so lush.
tropical almost the vegetation is.
Because it's like
climate.
it's like year round.
flat.
It's binary. They have wet season, dry season. It's a valley. It's a valley. So all this like
This is no happy accident. As with all things in Medellin, we soon found out there was a very specific reason for the sheer amount of palm trees and bright green foliage that pepper the 2.5 million resident city. A story my cousins and I learned the following day from Miguel, our phenomenal guide on the Medellin tour.
You see, Medellin is situated in a valley, almost like a bowl. So back in the 1960s, all the smoke produced by factories would just settle here, and you'd see what looked like fog, but no, it was actually smoke. To change the situation, a rule was established requiring a lot of greenery to be planted. The plants produce oxygen and prevent the smoke from lingering in the valley. That's why nature is such a fundamental and vital part of Medellin. In fact, harming it can have legal consequences. If you cut down a tree, even one right in front of your house, you could face legal repercussions.
As it turns out, Mo's childhood visiting Medellin was spent among plumes of diesel. The smell was so pervasive that he had immediately noticed a shocking lack of the dense odor upon his arrival that day. It was 15 years ago that the city's quest to improve its air quality began. I hadn't even been in the city 24 hours, and already it had become one of the clearest examples I've seen of how history's pendulum swings constantly between destruction and rebuilding, wounding and healing. We started the tour standing atop the Cerro Nutibara, a small mountain whose peak is home to Pueblito Paisa, a replica village that is inadvertently the perfect symbol of Medellin's tightrope walk between tension and restoration. At first glance, it's idyllic. Cobblestone streets, colorful facades, and charming courtyards that whisk you to a bygone era of Antioquia's history. But in fact, its very foundation tells a story of displacement.
In Guatape, there once was a village called Old Peñol. This village was flooded to create the Guatape hydroelectric plant. But before the flooding, an architect salvaged materials from the area, like doors, windows, and walls, and used them to create a replica of that ancestral town here on Cerro Nutibara. So, what you see in Pueblito Paisa is a replica of how villages in Antioquia looked 200 years ago. It was built to preserve that tradition and culture.
I didn't fully grasp the impact of this story until the next day during my trip to Guatape, when I found myself on a boat riding over the reservoir that was once home to an entire community. It was eerie to think of this whole village sacrificed for what a private company deemed progress. We'll talk more about this in a bit, but it is wholly fascinating that even with that decision to displace, there was a determination to preserve. Which brings us to the mountain itself, Cerro Nutibara, whose name carries the legacy of the Catio people and their fierce leader, Chief Nutibara. Here, history oscillates from honor to betrayal and back again.
When the Spanish came to these lands, the chief of the Catio tribe stood against them. He formed a small army of indigenous people who had never fought before because they had never needed to. His strength was such that the Spanish were forced to make a pact with him. The pact was this: there would be a duel to the death between Chief Nudabara and the Spanish marshal. If the chief won, the Spanish would retreat. If the marshal won, the indigenous people would surrender. In that duel, Chief Nudabara emerged victorious. But as is now widely known, the Spanish betrayed their promise. They assassinated the chief and his tribe on this very mountaintop and conquered these lands. To this day, Chief Nudabara is remembered as an example of leadership and strength, so much so that despite being an indigenous man armed only with an axe and bow, the Spanish, who had firearms, were afraid of him.
At this point, the tension I felt was my own, an all too familiar internal pendulum, pivoting from horror to guilt. Mo and I walked along the cobblestone streets of the model village, meandering into a reproduction of a Spanish colonial church, when I opened up about my long-time ancestral struggle. It's hard for me to be from Spanish descent, you know?
Why?
Because they were horrible.
Oh, yeah.
Just terrible. Just awful. Don't you ever think about that?
Yeah.
Go repent for your sins of being
Of Spanish descent? Yeah. You know, my genealogy is 75% Spanish.
Yeah, mine's 50.
50? Unfortunately, I can't make up for the sins of our ancestors. And this part of my ancestry in particular is something I reckon with in many places I visit. Seeing the destruction of the Spanish conquests that erased whole peoples and their cultures. Like me, Medellin is in a constant state of reckoning. You can't walk its streets without feeling the echoes of its past.
Sí, sean bienvenidos al pueblito paisa. Ustedes son la razón de ser de nosotros.
Or without being embraced by the songs of its people. Music is everywhere in Medellin. It spilled from the small locales as we wove through the crowds of El Hueco, a sprawling shopping district in downtown Medellin. It surprised us as we floated in the middle of the reservoir in Guatape, as one of the boat's staff, a musician known as El Sensacional, grabbed a microphone and serenaded us with original music.
Me fui con unos amigos a una fiesta parrandear y después de unos traguitos la empezaron a embarrar.
And soon enough, you'll hear about music's role in transforming a crime-ridden neighborhood into a burgeoning tourist attraction. I already knew paisas make up some of the most famous recording artists in the world. Karol G, Maluma, J Balvin, to name very few. But it really started to click for me as I was there in person, experiencing the swirl of lament and pride that flavored every conversation I had with a local. Paisas have mastered grief. For them, music isn't just entertainment. It's a way to unite. Despite decades of violence, the people of Medellin have refused to let those experiences define them. Instead, they've poured their hearts into creating joy through music, food, and community. It's as though they've chosen to sing, dance, and feast their way back to life. It's a clever way to cope, but what else can you expect from a city that's had to maneuver its way through a maze of monsters, as if they were playing a true crime chess match? One of the stops Miguel brought us to on our tour was the Medellin Metro. When I saw it on the itinerary, I was skeptical. What kind of history happens at a run-of-the-mill metro station? As it turns out, the importance of the Medellin Metro lies more in what didn't happen there.
Construction on the metro began in the 1980s, during a time when Pablo Escobar was setting off bombs all over the city. Because of this, the city came up with a clever idea. Do you know what was most important to Escobar's hitmen here in Colombia? They were very religious people. I'll give you that clue. The virgins, like the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. With this in mind, the city placed an image of a virgin at each one of its metro stations to prevent attacks. Because of this, neither Pablo Escobar, nor the guerrillas, nor the paramilitaries ever attacked the metro station.
Well, we've finally spoken his name. In this part of the world where his hurt was most concentrated, there are no cool shows or movies making him out to be a Robin Hood-like Tony Scarface. Here, he is a monster whose name is rarely spoken outside of tour groups. Because here, the scars of his reign of terror are still fresh. And yet, he was just one of Medellin's many tormentors. Another was the city's own government, which led to the creation of yet another, the FARC. We were riding the scenic cable car up the mountains of the vast Comuna 13 when Miguel began describing the history of this famously resilient community, whose streets had once been forcibly turned into trenches.
This story begins in the 1950s with the formation of an armed military group called the Guerrillas, or FARC. FARC stands for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. This military group was born out of a desire to defend themselves from government abuse. During the 1950s, the government exploited and stole from farmers, and when these farmers protested, they were killed. So, these people armed themselves to protect their livelihoods and their lives. But over time, the group became corrupted. They began doing the very same things the government had done: kidnapping, killing, and later becoming heavily involved in the drug trafficking business. And that's what ultimately brings us to the story of Comuna 13 today.
The cable car climbed steadily higher into the mountain, where cramped brick houses were stacked high like Jenga towers. We had reached a point where the streets below us were so narrow and steep that only scooters and motorcycles are legally permitted to maneuver them. Miguel continued.
We're about to see a mountain that was the perfect route to send narcotics to the United States. For that reason, the guerrillas decided to take control of Comuna 13. At first, they took over the mountain and gave the families living there two simple options: hand over your home or your life. These people had no choice but to comply. But later, the guerrillas thought, we already have the business. Now we need more employees. We need more military power. So they decided to descend into all the neighborhoods of Comuna 13 and gave the families there three more choices. Option 1. If a family had 2 children, they had to give one to the guerrillas, and the family would be allowed to visit them once a month. Option 2. They could give up a significant part of their house to be turned into a drug laboratory. Or option 3, once a month, for a set period of time, they had to cook for the guerrillas. But, and this is important, getting the materials and ingredients for cooking wasn't the guerrillas' problem. It was the family's responsibility. If a guerrilla went without food, the family paid the price. And there was one final unstated option written in the fine print. If they didn't like any of the 3 choices, they would disappear.
In the following clip, you'll hear Miguel provide disturbing details about the horrific things the FARC did to the children of Comuna 13. Please skip ahead 30 seconds if you'd rather not hear it.
Next came the training of the children. In this training, children were taught how to use weapons, use drugs, learn military language, and understand the drug trafficking business. And the final test, the child had to kill. Any child who didn't pass this test was sent back to their family, but only after having their face cut off, their body dismembered, and all the pieces placed in a bag. On top of the bag, they would place the child's face so the family knew exactly who was in it.
I felt sick hearing this. I still do. And to think this is only the tip of the iceberg of the atrocities that the people in Medellin have endured. I won't go into any more horrific details in this episode, but I felt it important to share this story because knowing or remembering the horrors brings us a step closer to preventing them from ever happening again. And if you're wondering what the government was doing about all of this, well, at the time, they had something else, or rather someone else, dominating their attention.
During all these years, the government never helped Comuna 13. And for the record, Pablo Escobar had nothing to do with the conflict in Comuna 13. But from 1984 to 1993, the government was too occupied with the war on drug trafficking. Bombs were being detonated in Medellín, in Cali, in Cartagena, and in Bogotá, which is why the government had no time for anything else besides Pablo Escobar.
It took 5 years after Escobar's death for the Colombian government to get involved. And when they finally did, it led to Comuna 13's tipping point. We descended back down the mountain on the cable car, retracing our path after having stopped at the very top of the route to take in sweeping views of the city. Most other places look so small from that high up, but somehow Medellin looks enormous. A blanket of brick structures of all shapes and sizes jutting out from patches of green, contained neatly by the mountains destined to encircle it. I felt equally dazzled and devastated even, and especially, as Miguel told us what it took for Comuna 13 to find its way back from that darkness. A daunting feat they were left to figure out alone.
It was thanks to a community leader in the Comuna named Héctor Pacheco. He was the first to tell the people of the Comuna, it's time for change. Let's trade drugs, death, and despair for music, art, and dance. That's when they created the cultural movement known as Casa Colacho, where they took young people who didn't know any other way of life and taught them music, art, and dance, helping them tap into the talent each one carried within. Through this, these individuals came together, stood up to the paramilitaries, and reclaimed control of their lives.
Gracias a la música, el arte y el baile.
We boarded a city bus that must have been the inspiration for the night bus in Harry Potter. A man in his mid-30s holding a microphone attached to a portable speaker climbed aboard just as the bus set out on its bumpy and whiplash-inducing jaunt through the mountainous roads of Comuna 13.
Bueno, hola chicos, les voy a compartir a los presentes en esta tarde de hoy un minuto de rap comedia, un minuto de freestyle.
I didn't know it then, but this kind of performance is the shtick in Comuna 13. You hear it set to the same beat happening all throughout 20 de Julio, the area to which our very hurried bus driver was shuttling us.
Seguramente está pensando, ojalá que yo no lo vea mañana. Pues el nivel de rap le sube que yo nunca le baje, porque a la amiga le quedaron demasiado bacano esos tatuajes, ¿verdad que sí, reina? Que se ve muy hermosa y encantadora, y se ve que en todo lo que ella hace, que ella es muy emprendedora. El rapero se lo recita y se lo explica. El pandita que me está grabando parece un empresario de Arabia Saudita, ¿verdad que sí?
On the spot, this performer freestyled about every person on the small bus. When he turned to me, he rapped about how he liked my bubbly disposition and my tattoos. It was impressive, and not just because I'm a sucker for compliments. It also set the tone for the trek to come, a bold and multi-sensorial climb through steep streets where reggaeton beckons you from neon-clad shops, while a breakdance performance materializes in front of you. Sculptures made for Instagram photo ops draw your attention to the view, and wildly colorful murals cover nearly every wall. Those streets that had once been turned into the trenches of a drug war had now been transformed, this time willfully, into a thriving tourist destination. In other words, Comuna 13 flexed two superpowers: the power of community and the power of market opportunity. And they're not the only paisas to have figured out this 1-2 punch. Very early the next morning, still processing everything I had learned, seen, smelled, and tasted the day before, I boarded a massive bus for a day trip to Guatape. The trip to Guatape can take anywhere from 90 minutes to 2.5 hours depending on Medellin's traffic, but it's also a scenic drive through gorgeous green mountains. This drive, and especially Guatape, made me fall head over heels for Antioquia, this particular region of Colombia. It oozes rural charm with just enough comforts to make a tourist feel right at home, which is exactly what it was built for. Remember that old flooded town of El Peñol? Well, this is where the town was relocated. As a result of the displacement, this community had to find a new means of survival.
They undertook a project where they decided to flood the entire old town to create a company. All those people were relocated here, to this area in the new Peñol. Initially focused solely on cattle ranching and farming, the creation of the reservoir forced and obligated the community to shift its economy entirely to tourism.
That's Ale, our expressive and well-versed guide. And by our, I don't mean my cousins and me. This time, I mean me and a busload of 20-something strangers, most of which were couples. Good thing I'm comfortable being the 25th wheel.
Can I join you guys? Of course. Awesome, thank you. I'm Michelle.
Elise. Like Ale explained, tourism is now the sole industry driving the Guatape economy, just like Comuna 13. However, in this case, they may be doing too good of a job. Because with landscapes, fresh air, and a cost of living like Guatape's, a large number of tourists tend to catch a bug many travelers are susceptible to. The main symptom? A ceaseless itch to move there. And as most of us who live in mid-sized to large cities in the US know, too much revitalization can quickly turn into gentrification.
This is a very, very negative issue for us Colombians because now it's practically impossible for us to buy property here. Even the smallest, most modest property is outrageously expensive. This problem is widely recognized as gentrification, and it's even worse for the locals, the people of Guatape. For them, it's incredibly difficult to maintain their lifestyle here because tourism drives up prices on everything, making it harder for those who've always called Guatape home.
We can all agree that rising costs pricing out locals is a bad thing. But we can likely also agree that tourism has given those same locals an opportunity to rebuild their community. Gentrification has become an increasingly trickier issue as advancements in transportation and technology bridge physical distances and make borders more nebulous. All the complexities of growth and tourism and a shrinking world aside, Guatape absolutely lives up to the hype. It's a town awash in vibrancy and flooded with the fragrance of warm arequipe and sweet arepas de choclo. Shops filled with mass-produced but very charming artisanal goods line the narrow cobblestone streets. A small multicolored fountain stands in the middle of an alleyway. The air is fresh, the sun is bright, and the temperature is crisp. Guatape is just super gosh dang cute. But it's more than that. It also represents a cornerstone of Paisa culture, making do with the resources and opportunities available to you. Spending time with Paisas and learning about their past and present taught me that these are not people who stay stuck in the sorrows of what was. They forge ahead, looking for windows when doors have closed, or heck, even a crack in the wall when every other opening seems sealed. One of my favorite examples of this is the story of La Piedra del Peñol, also known as El Peñón de Guatape. This towering granite protrusion is 656 feet tall. It's a bustling tourist attraction. And while the base of this immense Inselberg, which is apparently a word, offers plenty to see and do, the real draw is climbing up its 740 steps to see the enchanting view from its 7,000-foot altitude. In the US, this would be considered a national park, a government-owned natural wonder that's open to the public, profits no one, and is maintained through tax dollars. But such is not the case with El Peñón.
The first person to climb the rock was Luis Villegas, along with two of his best friends, back in 1954. It took them approximately 5 days. After this accomplishment, Luis Villegas decided to purchase all the land surrounding the rock. This means that, to this day, absolutely all the revenue and economic income from the site goes to the Villegas family and not to the government.
Maybe it's my lifetime being raised in one of the most capitalistic nations in the world, but I found this so shrewd of Villegas. He had the foresight to turn his achievement into generational income. Plus, it begs the question, is a government that's been plagued with vast corruption for decades entitled to those benefits? I didn't have such a strong opinion on the matter until the next day, after I visited the Casa Museo de la Memoria. It was my last full day of sightseeing before the weekend's wedding activities, and something was pulling me toward this museum. I had read that it was a space dedicated to reckoning with Medellin's tumultuous past and honoring the resilience of its people. No better way to reflect on everything I'd been learning. I requested a taxi on the Uber app, which, despite not being officially legal, is a common and affordable way to get around Medellin. Minutes later, my driver arrived. Small talk turned into deeper conversation, and I quickly asked if I could hit record, something I often do when I sense someone has a story to share. He said yes, I pressed the button, and that's when he told me a story I could have never anticipated.
I'm a victim of displacement due to violence. An armed group took my father when I was 16 years old. He still hasn't been found. He never appeared. It's been 20 years now. Directly or indirectly, I think violence has knocked on everyone's door in this country.
Elkin described how he had to flee, leaving behind his family and his home in rural Antioquia for an unfamiliar way of life in the big city that is Medellin. Elkin didn't even know where we were headed. I was sitting there listening to one man's personal tragedy, en route to a place where countless other stories of violence and survival are preserved. When we arrived at the Casa Museo de la Memoria, I stepped out of the car, not quite sure what to expect. The museum is perched on a small hill in the center of the city. Its imposing concrete structure reminded me of a bunker. The museum is free and offers a free audio guide on its app, but I needed to get some deeper perspective. Thankfully, Sebastián, the man assisting people at the front desk, was willing to become my impromptu guide. He explained how the museum came to be.
The museum was created as a symbolic measure of reparation for the victims of the armed conflict in Colombia, as part of a law called the Victims and Land Restitution Law. Under this law, Colombia is obligated to compensate for the damage caused by the conflict. According to how the law is structured, any violent death in Colombia is the responsibility of the state, because it is the state's duty to guarantee the lives of its citizens.
Then he shared this sobering number.
Today, Colombia officially recognizes 9 million victims of the conflict, spanning from 1948, the official beginning of the armed conflict in the country.
Sebastián then broke down the law's several sections, including land reparations for rural residents, financial reparations to family members of victims, and the creation of plaques, memorials, and museums like this one throughout the city. And just as a group of high school students started flooding the main lobby where we were standing, he told me about the final term of the law.
Another important aspect of this law is the obligation to educate Colombians about the history of the conflict. This helps people gain context about what happened, making it easier to prevent it from happening again.
So this was the reason so many kids, ranging in age from 11 or so to around 17, were here. This gruesome remembrance is a part of their school curriculum, to never forget, and in doing so, to hopefully never let it happen again. I finally went inside, greeted by high-tech exhibits that felt like a thread in a vast tapestry, weaving together the experiences of a people who have faced unimaginable hardship, yet continue to move forward. The Casa Museo de la Memoria is equal parts art museum and historical monument. Its small footprint is filled with digital displays that present sobering data about the number of lives affected by kidnapping, bombings, murders, mass murders, and disappearances. I found the younger of the student groups gathered in the main exhibit space of the museum in front of a photographic display of some of the worst bombings of the conflict. Their teachers explained to them the dynamics of the conflict and the lasting toll of the atrocities. Wandering the somber museum floor, I thought about how safe I'd felt during my time in Medellin, about how welcomed I'd been, about how privileged I was to learn about this through photos, videos, and conversations, rather than through the cruel hands of lived experience. I thought about how I hate that this is the story I'm telling you right now. The truth is, the last thing I wanted was to make this episode about violence. Raised as a Colombian in the US, I am minutely aware of the reputation we have. But there's no escaping the scars left by this country's myriad monsters. And I would be doing a disservice to Colombia and to you if I chose to ignore the very history that's shaped this nation. Because for Colombians, I think it's the sheer amount of hurt that's created a culture of passion and kindness. Colombians know better than anyone what Buddha reminds us. Life is suffering. That statement is a reminder not to find suffering, after all that's baked into the experience, but rather to find joy. Even in the midst of our conversation about his family's most traumatic event, Elkin and I started gushing about the beauty of this diverse country.
Colombia has about 6 regions. There are the Costeños, the Cachacos or Rolos, the Antioqueños, the Vayunos, the Caucanos, the Santanderianos, and the Guajiros. We're made up of several regions, and wherever you go, the accent is different, the culture is different, and even the landscape is different. It's incredible. No, seriously, it completely changes, including the food.
Colombia really is something special. Bias aside, it easily ranks as one of my all-time favorite destinations. It's full of so much cultural and natural beauty, alongside its complex and fascinating history. Medellin, in particular, is a city where the rubble of its past doesn't deter the blossoming of its future. It's a place that is constantly healing and honoring its wounds. And yet, like me, it lives in that in-between space, both deeply rooted in its identity and constantly reinventing itself. In Medellin, I found myself caught between celebration and introspection, between belonging and not belonging. It was a week that reminded me how personal history and collective history can intertwine, how identity can be both rooted and fluid, and how a city, like a person, can carry its scars while still blooming, by focusing not on its constant winters, but instead on its eternal springs. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Medellin. On the next episode of Globocurious, we head to Colombia's Eje Cafetero, or Coffee Axis, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the heart of coffee country. We'll explore the iconic Valle de Cocora and discover how the region's coffee culture shapes both its landscapes and its economy. Until next time, stay curious. Globocurious is an original production of Frequency Media. I'm Michelle Khouri, the host, writer, and executive producer. Lizzie Stewart is our producer. Claire Bidigary Curtis is our sound designer and mixer. Jessica Olivier is our creative consultant and script editor. Special thanks to Mo, Ashley, Miguel, Ale, Elkin, and Sebastian for allowing me to capture our experiences.
Acá en Colombia se tomó una chimba con todos los parceros, pero sé que no me van a entender.
Eso era lo más colombiano que podía decir. And cut.